The moderator this afternoon is well known, I'm sure, to everyone in the audience. He writes with such beauty and distinction for review of the news and American opinion and books of his own, poetry of his own. He is one of our outstanding writers, one of our great American writers, and we are always delighted to have him with us. And we were a little wondering whether he would be with us this year, but he said he'd come, and so it is with great satisfaction that I present to you now Professor E. Merrill Root.
Colonel Bunker, Mrs. McKinney, ladies and gentlemen, fellow Americans, and inheritors of a day that is sure to dawn. I could say many splendid things about our speaker this afternoon, but the first is very simple. He is not a liberal intellectual. Now, as you well know, a liberal intellectual may be defined as a vacuum surrounded by a sophistication. A liberal intellectual may have his facts, but he sees them through a glass eye darkly, and so he cannot lift them into truth. He has a sight that is very dim and an insight that is nil. He may have some knowledge, but he does not have wisdom. But he makes a lot of noise. He makes a noise that is febrile and yet blatant, that is petulant and yet at the same time arrogant. He makes a noise like 1,000 hornets shut in a tea kettle, and it's a little unpleasant to me. In fact, I sometimes think that a liberal intellectual might be entitled an SOC. Now, you may not know what that means, but it means the son of a crocodile. Now, you know, a crocodile bites you in two, and at the same time, he sheds tears, crocodile tears, and he smiles on his long, lugubrious face. In fact, I think his epitaph might very well be, well, I'll be willing to pay for his epitaph, the first one at least, not the second 1,000, but the first epitaph. It ought to be engraved on his tombstone, "Gone with his wind." Now, very fortunately, our speaker this afternoon is not at all like that. In fact, he is like the good Greek giant Antaeus. Antaeus stood upon the living earth. He drew his strength from the living earth. If he fell to earth or if he was thrown to earth, he arose with threefold strength. And that is like our speaker today. He is a man of reality. He was a naval officer. He has been an industrialist. He has been a banker. He has been a newspaper man. He is an author. He is a man of reality. And because of that, he is the good giant Antaeus. Now, the greatness of such a man is, as I say, his reality. And this man, he has even owned a gold mine. Now, that is stunning, to own a gold mine, a mine of that luminous, that richly heavy, that smoothly soft, that wonderful metal like a wax of heaven, like a metal of the sun. He has owned a gold mine. Now, you might think I am covetous, but I assure you that I am not covetous of his gold mine. I have my own gold. I live in the inner world, the inner kingdom, and like John Keats, I can say, much have I traveled in the realms of gold. I've traveled in literature, in art, in philosophy, in all these things of the inner kingdom. And I have myself the loveliest gold mine in all the world. I have a gold mine that is like a sort of tiptoe sun, like a dancing sun. I have my wife, Dorothy Jewell, and she is my gold mine, so I am not covetous. But at the same time, this is stunning. This is fascinating. Think of a man who owns a gold mine. A man who owns a gold mine. I am tempted to tamper with certain very famous verses. I never owned a golden mine. I never hoped to own one. But this I wish, oh, very much, right now, that I might see one. And fortunately this afternoon, we are able to see through the words of this distinguished speaker, we are able to see a gold mine. And more than that, he's a man from Texas. Now that is a wonderful thing. I'm very fond of the state of Texas. But there are two kinds of Texans. One I'm a little dubious of, one I'm very enthusiastic about. One kind of Texan forgets. One kind of Texan remembers. And our speaker remembers. He remembers the Alamo. He remembers it historically. He has done gallant justice to the noble Mexican Americans who stood for the Constitution of 1924, who were against Santa Anna, who helped the Republic of Texas. He is for them. He is a Texan who remembers. And so it is an honor to me, and it is a privilege for you that I can introduce to you our distinguished Mr. A.B.J. Hammett, who is a Texan who remembers the Alamo.
Thank you, Dr. Root. I really would rather just sit here and listen to you than to proceed with this program this afternoon. And I feel highly honored to be here today and introduced by such a distinguished northern person from this area of the country as Dr. Root. I also am very happy to be here and be part of this program. And I want to first pay my sincere respects to Colonel Bunker and to Mrs. McKinsey, because I know that these people have spent many, many hours of hard work. There's a great deal of liability and responsibility attached to a meeting of this kind that most people really don't realize until they go through it. I have been involved in some enterprises that were rather large, and I know that these people deserve a tremendous amount of credit for this. I'd also like to compliment the pianist on his 17th birthday, and also the lovely music we had here, and also our vocalist. I really enjoyed it very, very much. I'd like to hear you again sometime. Now, due to a shortage of time, I guess, I'm going to launch right in this. I'm going to do away with ordinary preliminaries. It's a rather difficult thing. John Dean prepared 250 pages of written material for about 3 or 4 days of activity that was going on in the White House. And my subject goes back 5,000 years before Christ. So I don't want to fill this room up with written material. And not only that, but I don't want any written material. I understand it's a bad thing to have on your possession or around. So like my old friend Vance Barnett, who I was fortunate enough to run into here, we were old friends from California. In fact, California was my home before I went to Texas. And we have many good friends in the picture industry and others that we've known. We've had a good time reminiscing about the past. And like Vance said the other night, that he threw his material away also. I think he used good judgment. And he was going to give it to you right off the top of his head. Well, I think that top of the head business came from his friend Milton Berle. It wasn't original. However, this is going to be from the top of my head also. This subject of mine today is something that everyone is interested in and everyone is concerned with, but most people are not aware of what their concern really amounts to and where it originated and what it's all about. And I'm going to try to take you back on a trip in the past, and I don't want to in any way insult the intelligence of you people, because I think that this is probably one of the best informed audiences and group of people that I've probably ever been before, or that there is in this country. And I want to also commend every one of you on your work that you do constantly to keep abreast of conditions and times and things that are transpiring in this country and abroad. I'm also extremely pleased to see here so many young people in this audience. I address schools from the 4th and 5th grade, and I get the best audiences because these people have open minds. They're willing to listen to patriotic things. I give patriotic awards to these children, and I've created quite an activity that other people are following in the grade schools, which in those classes and those smaller people have been completely neglected over the years. And they are people who, properly instilled with patriotism, by the time they reach the high school, they're ready to talk about America and patriotism rather than to learn how to make a bomb and throw it in the building and blow it up. Now, after these fellows reach the age where they're ready to tear the building apart, it's a little late to try to convince them in the time that you have left that things should be different. So in this talk today, which relates back a good many years ago, I think that the young people who will be handling important matters in possibly a few years to come should know, and if they get some good from what I have to say, that's fine, and they may want to go back and research some of these things further, because I can only touch upon just the highlights of these things today. Also, some of the older people that are here, I think we're rather prone to forget, and we have a habit of reading these things, knowing about them, and then they pass and we get acclimated to the conditions, and are conditioned, in other words, to the policies and the things that are going on. And we really don't realize why we're in the fix that we're in and why we're in the trouble that we're in. So that I intend to touch on, and I don't want you people to think that I feel that you don't know these things or don't remember them, but I hope that it will refresh your memories somewhat, and that as a result of that, maybe some other constructive action can be taken that will be helpful all the way around. I feel that before I get into my subject, that one of our main problems that we have in our nation's capital today, and of course this starts on the local level as well, is that we have inexperienced, immature people in charge of our affairs and our government who know nothing of the subject matter in which they're supposed to be there to handle for us. That's been proven to me many times. I've spent many, many months in Washington, D.C., and I at one time knew practically everybody on Capitol Hill. And unfortunately, some of the good old solid citizens that were patriotic Americans that believed in the Constitution and what it stood for, they're not with us anymore. These people have passed away, and we have a new group of people. And it's mainly these people that I'm going to talk about that have come about through the last couple of generations that have been deprived of certain knowledge that they should have had. It hasn't been taught in the schools, the universities, and the colleges, and it hasn't been taught in business. And actually, it's astounding when you talk to these people and find out how little they know about one of the most important subjects that affects their very lives, and they don't realize it and have no idea of what it's about. The average person on the street today, when you talk about gold, well, they talk about, well, they read there's a gold crisis, there's this, that, and something else. And in reality, they are attaching it to Europe, to France, or to Germany, or Italy, or Switzerland, or someplace else, and they palm it off that, well, this doesn't affect us. So what's out of sight is out of mind, and they go to the next thing, cocktail bar or someplace else, and that's it. Actually, what goes on in these foreign countries with gold has been the most important thing that today is really affecting our very lives in a manner in which it could be total bankruptcy. Now, I'm going to mention a little bit about gold because I think you should know and refresh your memories on what we're talking about. Gold was known to man thousands of years before Christ, and it was then known to be the most precious metal ever obtainable. It was used in trade and commerce in those days. And hundreds of years before Christ, gold coins were made and used and produced in different countries that used them. Empires have fallen, kings and queens have left their thrones, there's been wars fought, people have done everything for the lust of gold. Gold has not only been a servant of man all these years, but it's also been a master. And that is still true today, 100%. It never has changed. Gold, in all of those years up until the present time, is still the number one commodity, metal, that is always acceptable worldwide, any place in the world, and used in trade and commerce, and acceptable by everyone. And we were in a very fortunate position years ago in this country where gold made that possible as a servant for us in the United States. This gold situation, going up through the thousands of years, remained exactly just what I've described it. It never changed, and it hasn't changed yet. The only thing that's changed is that for 40 years in this country, we've been living behind a gold curtain. By comparison, we more or less have been softened up on this thing, like the people were in Germany after Hitler took over and began to control the press, control the news, brainwash the people. And I know that myself, I used to have offices down in Madison Avenue, New York City. And we went to Germany frequently after World War I. We had many people go there. Tourist business was good. Germany was making a fine recovery. We knew the German people. They were fine people. And when all of this began to happen, we couldn't understand in this country why these intelligent people would become subservient to all of these things that were being forced upon them. We were reading about it. It was impossible. We couldn't believe it. And yet it was a fact. Well, when people don't know any better, when they don't know what's going on, and when the news is suppressed from them, they only get the news and the information they're supposed to have from the government. Why, that's what happens, and it's happened here, and people haven't realized it on this gold situation. Now, in talking about the gold itself, in relation to the North American continent, I think it's also important that we should know of the gold in this country and where it originated and where it started. Now, this is a piece of history that likewise has been deleted from encyclopedias. I've tried many times to get it in the encyclopedias. It's been deleted from textbooks. It's been completely obliterated, left out ever since 1865. Gold in this country first was known to originate, the Indians had it, and the Spanish that came to our shores in Florida. Hernando de Soto came up with Ponce de Leon through the southeastern state areas, which are states now, in search of Indians that were reported to have large quantities of this yellow dust, and they found it. And these particular areas and states are what is now known as Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee. They weren't states at that time. De Soto left, and this was in 1730, or 1530. And up through the period of time until 1730, we began to operate in the United States, or in this part of the country, in gold production. Now, most people think that gold was found in 1849 in California, and that's where gold originated in this country. And from then on, that's where we were in the gold business. Well, that's far from the truth. And it's part of history, as I say. It's been eliminated, and it should be reproduced and put into every textbook and into encyclopedias. Well, anyway, in 1750, we began to put mines together in this country, in Georgia, North and South Carolina, Virginia areas. We had as many as 200 gold mines or more operating in Georgia, and about that many in all the other states. We had the British, we had the French operating gold mines in our country. They were shipping much of our gold ore back to France and to England in those days. We also had our early statesmen, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, John Calhoun, and Governor Oglethorpe, and all of these people. Practically all of their early wealth came from gold production in this rich gold belt. Incidentally, this gold was of the highest quality gold that's ever been known in the United States. It practically all ran up into 98 and 99 fines, which is a very high quality of gold. These gold mines operated with slave labor, and you could find anywhere from 200 to 300, 400 slaves working the streams and picking up these gold nuggets. Some of them were 5, 6, 8 inches long of beautiful filigree gold. And there were sacks full of this nugget gold that were picked up in these streams every day. The gold business was a flourishing business in this country, in all of those states. And as a result, we had the first mint that was established in the United States in Philadelphia on Filbert Street. And this mint was the only one that there was in the country. Well, with the advent of the commerce and the business and industry that took place in these southeastern territory state areas on the gold business, the roads and trails were dangerous. They were infested with wild Indians and animals and floods and everything else. And it almost made it physically impossible to get communications back and forth between Philadelphia to the mint. And it was impossible to get the gold up there to put it into coins so that these people could use their coins in their business and commerce. Consequently, we had the first case of counterfeiting that was ever known in the United States. There was a German assayer in Lumpkin County, Georgia, near Dahlonega, and he and his sons decided that in order to meet the emergency and have coins to operate with in that area, that they would produce gold coins of their own. And they did. This was Templeton Reed and Sons. And over in Rutherford, North Carolina, we had another similar circumstance. Christian Beckler and his son that were assayers, and they came into the gold minting business of coins. Well, it wasn't long until we had the same old deal started. It was in force then, the Treasury Department. They soon swooped down upon these people, and they accused them of counterfeiting. And they were brought before the justice and the bar of justice, and the result was that it was the first case in history of counterfeiting in the United States against the United States Treasury. And these people pled their case on the basis that the coins were needed. There was no way they could get coins from Philadelphia and get their raw material up there for minting. And also, when the thing got down to actual proof, they found out that both the coins made by Christian Beckler and also Templeton Reed contained more gold of a finer quality and better than the coins that were made in Philadelphia. So the result was that they were acquitted, and they were allowed to proceed and continue in the private minting of money in this country. And I don't think from that day to this, except with the Federal Reserve, that there's ever been anything to ever equal it. And I thought that was a rather interesting sidelight on gold in our country that I'm sure not too many people are familiar with. This experience in the gold mining industry then led to the United States government establishing one of the largest mints that was ever built in the United States. And where do you think it was built? It was built in the mountains of North Georgia, Dahlonega, Georgia. Does anybody in this room know about this? If there are, please hold your hands up, will you? Well, as several of you do. At any rate, this large mint was built in Dahlonega, Georgia, and they turned out millions of dollars of the finest gold coins that are known. Now, these coins that were turned out in those days, to show you that products in Georgia are not as bad as some people would say they are, $2.50 and $5 and $10 gold pieces are today worth $5,000 to $8,000 and $10,000 a coin, if you can find one of them. So there has been a little bit of inflation that's taken place there too. The mint in Dahlonega, Georgia, immediately prompted another mint to be built, similar size, in Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte, North Carolina at that time was the Pittsburgh of the South. Due to the fine quality of manganese iron ores and iron produced in the Charlotte area and through the Appalachian area, all of these steel and iron rims made for the wagons that went to California in 1849. My people went there. They were on that trip. Were made in Charlotte, North Carolina. And this other second mint was established in about 1838, a year after the one in Dahlonega. And they operated till about 1861, both producing a tremendous number of fine gold coins. In 1861, the Civil War period came about. And of course, the mining of ore in these areas came to a standstill. Some of the miners decided to leave and started out for California. John Rusk, who was a well-known patriot of the Mexican War and the Texas War and the Alamo with Sam Houston and others, left a gold mine that he had in Georgia looking for his partner who had stolen his gold, and he wound up trying to find this man down in the Army where he heard he was in Texas. And so John Rusk turned out to be one of the Texas heroes as a result of looking for a crook that had stolen his gold. And the mint at Charlotte and the one at Dahlonega, as I say, folded up, stopped production in 1861. They later were destroyed. At the end of 1849, which was in that same period, gold was discovered in California in our country, and likewise from there on up the west coast and into the Klondike, and then later in the Arizona Territory and in the New Mexican Territory and in Colorado. So we do have a real broad history of gold production and what it really meant to this country years and years, 100 years before we really got into gold or people really knew what it amounted to. The next step in the program was after the Civil War. Why, the prejudices that existed at that time were terrific. Places like Atlanta and other cities were sacked, and burned, and ruined. And in Margaret Mitchell's book, she was a cousin of mine that wrote the story Gone with the Wind, properties were completely destroyed. The whole city, everything else was gone in ruins. And it was generally the idea that the intention was that the South should never rise again. Consequently, the wealth and the things that we had in the South of intrinsic value were deleted and taken out of textbooks so that no one would have a desire to go to the South for any reason whatsoever. And in that connection, they left these people with a little bit of raw land, big plantation owners in the past, and fine cultured people with nothing but a few peanuts and some cotton to grow. By the way, that word peanuts rang a bell with me. I was on the plane coming over from Chicago the other day, and a man from Washington sitting next to me asked me if I knew what everyone in Washington was making the most money out of today down there. And I said, no, what? And he says, well, it's those fellows that have the franchises on the peanut business selling all those peanuts to those monkeys down there. So, and by that same token, I think it possibly there might be a lot of peanut franchises open in most of the small towns in the country on up to the state capitals. I think there'd be a good business for a lot of people to get into. I don't think there's any monopoly on it in Washington, in other words. So after the Civil War and after the gold production after the war began in the West, why, this country really began to make strides. We began to amass gold that had never been known before in the history of the world. And up until the turn of the century, the 19th century, why, we were coming into such a terrific gold position that we were the strongest nation monetarily in the world, and our currency later was known all over the world as the strongest dollar that had ever existed. People would trade anything for an American dollar, and they had a good reason to do that. This particular little history of the gold evolution of it up till that time resulted in the next thing I think of importance that came along that put us on a toboggan, a well-greased one, on a track, one-way road with marking signs all the way telling us of the destruction and havoc that was going to come if we continued to go. At the end of the road, nothing but bankruptcy and complete ruin. We got on this toboggan back in 1914 when, in a very fast manner, we had our constitutional rights violated, and our rights to own gold and our rights to manufacture gold and make the coins in this country and to set the interest rates provided by the Constitution for the Congress representing we people, that was taken away from us. It was overnight voted by another bunch of these people sent to Washington to give to a private corporation that I don't think any person in this room to this day has ever seen a financial statement of that corporation. There's a Federal Reserve Bank that was established. Now, just prior to the time that this happened, our government was expanding in business and commerce. And like a big industry located, we'll say, in New York or Boston, that had a national distribution, it was necessary to have some branch offices and warehouses to service the growth of this country and the nation. So it was planned to establish some branch offices in the leading trading and business centers population-wise too, like Richmond and Atlanta, Dallas and Denver, Chicago and Cleveland and Los Angeles and possibly El Paso, someplace like that. Well, what happened as a result of this vote? The Federal Reserve Board, as you all know, was established, and bank, and we were taken over by a private corporation run by 7 directors. And they've had full control of our money and interest rates ever since, and nothing has ever been done about it. Now, prior to that time, we had a medium of checks and balances in this country, which kept us from inflation, which we've been in the middle of ever since we had our money started to be tinkered with Franklin Roosevelt. And this particular checks and balances system was one where our money was backed up by gold. And if we were going to print more money and issue more money when it got into the paper money, which is more convenient to handle than silver or heavy gold in your pockets, if we were going to produce more paper money in order to safeguard ourselves on checks and balances and to keep an inflation from hitting us, why, we necessarily had to produce and buy and accumulate some more gold from someplace in order to back up any additional money we'd print. So therefore, just by a simple automatic procedure, there was no way that we could have surpluses of money, which is the cause of the inflation today, and surplus money, extra money, and printing press money, unless we did have the gold to back it up. Well, that's what happened then. I think the next step on this toboggan, the next station we come to, probably be in 1934. This is the most important one. Here we come along to the Dumbarton-Oaks Agreement. We come along to where, at this point I might mention that back at the turn of the century and before, it is historically recorded that our nation was infiltrated with subversives who had ideas and plans against the best interest of our country, and we've got them today. So these people came along in 1934, known subversives, should have been shot, deported, and everything else. But instead of that, they were in the Treasury of the United States, and they got Franklin Roosevelt's ear and became advisors to him, and we changed our whole gold picture in this country. We were ordered to go out and take our gold ornaments, our gold jewelry, and every bit of gold we had in our possession, all of our gold coins, our gold bills that we could transfer and change in exchange for gold dollars anytime we wanted to, and we had to turn these in. Many of you people can remember that. We had to turn in all of this gold, and who do we turn it into? The Federal Reserve Bank. We still don't know whatever happened to it. And in turning in all of this gold, we built up and amassed and continued to amass a pile of gold in this country behind our money, which was backed by gold, to where we owned in the United States government more gold than all of the other countries in the world combined. Now that's an awful lot of gold. And therefore our money was stable, it was strong, and the United States of America had respect, because in all the other countries of the world, and it's still true, about the only respect they have for you is your money and your military strength, and when you lose both, you're out of business. So with this advent of circumstances that took place, the situation then was one where we didn't have any gold, and immediately we were placed behind what I call a gold curtain that started in 1934. From then on, it was a penitentiary offense. It was a heavy fine, $10,000 or more, if you had gold, if you owned it, and if you dealt in it, or if you mined it or anything else, unless you were under a contract with the government. What gold was mined had to be sold to government. And at that same time, Franklin Roosevelt, who started tinkering with our money system, by a stroke of the pen one morning decided he was going to increase his position in the Treasury a little bit, and he devalued the dollar, which raised the price of gold from $20 to $35 an ounce, which it was set at, and thereby gave him a big paper balance. And when Carter Glass, who was one of our prominent statesmen in those days, was asked what he thought about it, and other senators in Washington. They openly admitted they thought it was the worst skin game and bunco deal that had ever been pulled off on the American people. Well, we've lived to see the day when that's come about, only in reverse now. So that situation then went into where we had a direct control over the world's largest stockpile of gold right in Washington by President Franklin Roosevelt. And the price of gold was set by Roosevelt. And as I say, this was in 1934. My secretary mailed me up a little item here which I think might be appropriate to read to you at this time in connection with that, which was the price of gold fixing. Now, Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau was in the Treasury at that time, and this is an article that was in Collier's Magazine, printed in 1947. So you see, there's been a lot of interest in what went on and some exposures even back then. Former Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau has left an unforgettable picture of how the gold price was determined from day to day in Washington. Now imagine this. Here's our gold, all of the stockpile of gold in the world. And we've got people over in London as ambassadors making whiskey contracts, and we've got others scattered around in other capitals where it's easy to trade. We got fellows like Jesse Jones from Houston, who was a personal Democratic longtime friend of the machine, who came up as Secretary of Commerce and also head of the RFC Commission, who was in on this deal. And lots of people asked the question, well, how did all of these people suddenly become not multimillionaires, but they were millionaires many, many, many times over? You could never estimate it. Well, it's very simple when you just look at the record, as old Al Smith used to say. And let's look at it. Here's what it says. President Roosevelt passed the Gold Act and deprived American citizens of owning gold. However, certain citizens, investors, and wealthy people were allowed to trade and were still allowed to trade in and buy gold on the foreign markets. The report by Henry Morgenthau on how the gold prices were determined from day to day in Washington tells quite a story, and it should be remembered that at a time the United States government owned more gold than all the countries in the world. Therefore, the price determined in Washington was a price that was accepted elsewhere except on the black market. Secretary Morgenthau, on October 25, 1947, wrote this article that was published in the now defunct Collier's Magazine, and he says, quote, every morning, now get this, this is the way our money business was being handled back in those days in Washington. Of course, this wasn't 1947, this was back in 1934 on up. It says, every morning, Jesse Jones and I would meet with George Warren in the President Roosevelt's bedroom while he was resting to set the price of gold. President Roosevelt would lie comfortably in his old-fashioned three-quarter mahogany bed. The actual price made no difference. One day, when I must have come in more than usually worried about the state of the world and conditions, we were planning on increasing the price of gold from 19 to 22. Roosevelt took one look at me and he suggested that the price will be 21. I asked then, well, why 21? It's a lucky number, the president said. It's 3 times 7. Now imagine this. This is the way our gold prices were being fixed for worldwide speculations in all the markets in the world except here in the United States. We didn't have any. We were behind the gold curtain. But the privileged people were able to trade gold on the London market, Zurich market, all the other gold markets all around the world, Hong Kong and wherever, even in the black markets. So he says, I noted in my diary, he kept a diary also, like John, what's his name in Washington? He says, I noted in my diary at this time, if anyone really knew how we set the price of gold, I think they would be terribly frightened. Well, we're still shaken up over it a little bit when you hear these things. Anyway, this situation went on and on and on. And finally, we come along to the next portion of this fast toboggan ride, and all the time we're gaining momentum in this downward trend. And in 1942, oh yes, in 1934, we also brought into being these same subversives who set up the Import-Export Bank in the country and other institutions that were put together for the purpose of disposing of our gold and our other money and property. And these were all originated by Harry Dexter White and a number of others that are well known to you people. The record is all there. And Roosevelt bought the whole package, went for it, and that's what went on. I'll go back to this a little bit later in conclusion and read you some figures on it. At that particular time, 1942, we had another terrible experience. President Roosevelt was induced by these same people to really put us out of business. He was induced with the war that he had coming on to close all of the gold mines in the United States by an illegal order, incidentally, just a presidential order, number L208. And he was told that if he would do this, that the miners working in the gold mines would immediately leave and go to work in the copper mines, and copper would be more badly needed than gold. So based upon an emergency order of that kind, which was no fact in it because there's never been a copper miner that ever worked in a gold mine, even to this day, why, President Roosevelt issued this order to close all the gold mines in the United States. And he closed 9,000 of them. Not 900, but 9,000. And there were 400 of these 4,000 of these gold mines that were real good active gold mines. Now at that time we owned and had constructed and built and engineered the finest gold recovery machinery of any country in the world. Most countries that even had gold were unable to produce it because they didn't have the know-how or the way to get the gold out and extract it and refine it. So Roosevelt came along, closed 9,000 gold mines, and sometimes I hear all this same old stuff over and over again about Appalachia. That's been worked to death for the last 15 or 20 years with more money, more money, more money. Well, what Appalachia was a Sunday school picnic compared with what happened then. In this closing order, he not only closed up 9,000 gold mines in the country, but he put out of business throughout the entire nation, directly and indirectly, several 100,000 people out of work, and he bankrupted 250 towns and cities in the California area and coast alone. Now, this doesn't take in all the rest of the country and places that suffered as a result of this. And nothing has ever been done to this day with any redress for these people or the things that happened. And then the next step in this gold closing deal. When you close a gold mine, you don't go down like you're closing up a dress shop or a restaurant or something else and turn the key in the door, come back a year or two later when it's time to open up again or season is right, and dust off things, a little coat of paint, and you're back in business. Now, a gold mine is a very sensitive thing. It is a network of electrical equipment. It's pumps and vents and air ducts, everything you can think of in one, and all very expensive, with cribbing and everything to hold these tunnels up and what have you. And it's all blocked out. It takes years, a lot of engineering and work and problems to do this, and very costly. So when a gold mine is closed, it automatically begins to fill with water because the pumps aren't working, there's no electricity, and the whole thing deteriorates. The shafts fill with water, your cribbing goes to pieces, everything is lost. So to rehabilitate a closed gold mine, even after 6 or 8 months, is a gigantic undertaking and one of magnitude of money that you just can hardly realize. So this is also part of the destructive program that ensued from this. The next thing that happened along with it was that before the machinery and all of these pieces of equipment that were good were ruined, why, they were immediately taken out of these gold mines. We had engineers that were sent to the gold mines. They stripped them of all the valuable know-how equipment, the very latest equipment that we had. They were taken out, and what was done with this? Well, they were boxed and crated. They were transported to Seattle. And in Seattle, we had ships taken out of our fleet, badly needed in the war effort for munitions and food and other things to get to our boys that were in service. No, we took these ships out of service. We sent them to Seattle. They were loaded, shipload after shipload, with all of our valuable gold mining equipment and with the engineers and with all kinds of other supplies, and they were sent to Russia. And all of our gold mining equipment was given to Russia. Everything was any good, along with the plans, the details, the blueprints, the operators, the mechanics, and the machinists, and the whole business. And we went into Russia, which had known big deposits of gold and uranium and other things which they'd never been able to mine. And we set them up in the gold mining business. With our money, our gold, and of course our ships were never returned. They stayed there too. And the result of that was simply this. Had we not sent this to Russia, Russia probably today wouldn't even have the atomic bomb, because they had no way to mine uranium. They started the uranium business after they got in this mining equipment with gold. And here we were, closed up in our gold production, and we'd been mining and putting into our treasury an average of about 5 million troy ounces of gold a year. Russia comes along with our gold mining equipment and starts upping their production from a few thousand ounces a year to where the last reports that anybody ever heard, which they don't turn out very freely, was somewhere between 12 and 15 million ounces a year they were piling up. Now this goes back 30 years they've been doing this. And in addition to that, they were taking money that they got from us as gifts and so forth and buying gold around on the other markets at the bargain price of $35 an ounce. Well, that was not bad enough. We had other things that happened. Along after Roosevelt died and Truman was in the picture, someplace up and down the line with these same advisors, we found out that we had also been a little overgenerous, and we had also shipped to Russia 23 money plates of our United States money, 23 negative and 23 positive plates. Not only that, but we sent the ink, we sent the paper, we sent the whole works. Here it is. And General Lucius Clay in the European theater, before he realized what had happened, had redeemed over $350 million worth of money that he had never issued. And then they started looking into this thing, and an old friend of mine, Major Racy Jordan, who's now not with us anymore, knew of these things and exposed them to the Senate and the Congress. And it's now believed that there was some place, it's reported and admitted by Congress and the government, that there was over $2 billion worth of our money that was redeemed in gold from this bogus money deal, plates. And some people have stated that they believe the figure might run as high as $20 billion worth that went up, these people. So you can see we were going downhill. Now all the time with these agreements where the United States people had turned their gold in, were not allowed to own any and couldn't have any, the foreigners, of course, could take our American dollars that we were giving to them by the shiploads sending over, and they were even taking goods and things and selling them, converting them into dollars, and then trading that back to us for gold, which we were redeeming all the time. So our biggest stockpile of gold in the United States began to go down like this. And everybody else's stockpile in the world began to go up like that. The have-nots began to take from the haves. And as a result of that, the gold that these people were acquiring and accumulating in Russia, their production began to go up, and we had no production at all. So we were in a status quo position with production, had none whatsoever, and in our big stockpile it began to dwindle all the time. Now this was all prearranged back in 1934 in this Dumbarton-Oaks agreement and the others subsequently made, and that is what put us on the real track to bankruptcy with this business. Now all the time, while the people in this country seem to think that gold, well, that's something for the foreigners and the birds, we don't have anything to do with it and forget about it unless we're not interested, and no one has told anything about it in the country. You're behind this gold curtain. All the time this is going on in your country, and it's one of the most serious things that could have ever been going on, and no one was able to do anything about it. Well, we come up to the next way station as we're sailing by with these signs to destruction, and what do we find there? Well, we find that this thing went on until, with inflation and the drainage of our gold, until 1957 and 1958. And at that time we had one of the most important Senate investigations that was ever held in the country. And it was very little publicized. It was chaired by Senator Harry Byrd. And we had one of the world's best experts on gold and money matters, Senator Malone, who was also in this committee. At that time, in addition to all the other things that caused inflation, and that they also had every economist from every big industry, Bernard Baruch and everyone you could think of. And they made their decisions and their findings on what had caused the inflation and so forth, and also their warnings, which at that time to the government were extremely dangerous and it had to be changed. With regard to gold, it was pointed out and learned at that time by testimony, and I have it in my book, Merrill, We Spend and Spend, which was all given to me by Harry Byrd after he died. He wouldn't let me have these transcripts before he died, but the day he died, his office mailed me a huge crate with all of these exact transcripts, which I reproduced most of them into a book. And he had told me that he wanted it in a book, but he wasn't able to let it out of Washington because of some of the other people that were still connected with it. And so later I put this into this book. And I think we printed 30,000 copies of them. We got about 500 or about 50 left of that book. And it's a real revelation and also an education to know just what really happened. We found in that investigation that our Secretary of the Treasury and our head of the Federal Reserve Board, Martin, neither one of these people had any knowledge of actually how much gold we had on hand that belonged to us. And when it was all finally worked down, we found that we only had about $15 billion worth of gold left. Well, that was a terrible shock. And then it was pointed out by Senator George Malone that if these foreign countries should ever decide to want to cash their dollars in for our gold, that we would be in a hell of a fix, that we wouldn't have the gold to pay them. It would be nothing but bankruptcy. And they could do it. Well, of course, the head of the Federal Reserve Board and the head of the Treasury Department at that time and all of these other disciples of Alger Hiss and Harry Dexter White entered into the picture, and oh, that'll never happen. Why, these people are all good people, and none of that would ever take place, which it has, as you know, today. And this was in 1957. Well, it seemed like these things ran in a cycle of about 5 or 6 years. They just couldn't hold together any longer than that without compounding the crime worse. So finally, we come along to 1965. And in 1965, the pressure was so great on the United States government to redeem dollar certificates for gold by foreign nations that we had in our Congress and our president at that time, and prior to that, they'd taken it up with John Kennedy, and he was asked what he would do about it. And the record shows that he said, well, if they want it, why, we'll just take some of the gold away from our Federal Reserve backing of our money. At that time, we had dropped it down to where we had 50% backing, 25% against the money in circulation, and 25% against the reserve money. So Kennedy said, well, if they get hot and come and get it and want it and demand it, why, to keep peace with them and to satisfy them, we'll take off our 25% reserve and let them have that. Well, when Lyndon came into the picture, he did that. And he twisted the arm of our people down in Congress, and they voted, if you can imagine this, to weaken our own money by another 25%. That meant 75% had been taken off of our money in reserve. Well, now, up until that time, our money was still firm worldwide. Everybody respected our money. And when this happened, that was the handwriting on the wall. Every money changer in the world, and every place in the world except here in this country, who are well-experienced people in gold. They're scholars at it. They've been in this business all their lives, and their forefathers ahead of them. It's part of their life. And here we are for 40 years and don't know anything about it. We've been kept in the dark, and our 2 generations of statesmen and people in Washington have never owned a piece of gold, never seen a gold piece, and know nothing about the situation, so to speak. And here we wind up finding ourselves in this predicament with Lyndon Johnson getting the Congress to vote to give away the 25% cover on our reserve money. Well, that, as I say, was the handwriting on the wall. The foreign countries immediately took advantage of it, and then they began to see a trend that we were scraping the bottom of the bucket, that our dollar wasn't as sound as it used to be. And they began to get a little panic-stricken over the fact that they held billions of dollars on hand. So they wanted to cash them in for gold. Lyndon continued to cash in these dollars. And finally, without ever stopping on the thing, he came along until 1967, and what did he do? He went to the Congress again, the same bunch of people I'm talking about. And he induced his members of Congress, and by a vote of 76 to 7, imagine, we only had 7 people in Washington, D.C., who had sense enough to know that our money was something that we should protect, and we should have something behind it, otherwise we'd have complete total destruction and bankruptcy that could follow it. So Johnson pushed it through, and with a vote of some 76, I think it was, to 7, the bill was passed to take the last remaining 25% of the gold cover that we had to back up our money with. And today, that money that you have is worth just exactly the piece of paper that's printed on, no more, no less. Now, every foreigner and money changer in the world knew that. And that's why we got into all of this trouble and problem that you read about and hear about that nobody at home has paid much attention to, the man on the street and the average person that's not familiar with these things. Again, because they've been kept in the dark for 40 years with it. So this thing then developed into a situation where we compounded our crime against our American people in, I guess, one of the most serious ways that we could ever do it. In 1965, from 1957 to 1965, as Senator Malone and these other people had pointed out, that we were on the way to destruction. The thing had to stop. We had to change it. And we had no changes made. No one in the government did one single thing to change it. And just a few years later, from 1968 till 1965, instead of having $15 billion worth of gold on hand, we owed the foreign governments $24.5 billion of gold that we didn't have. So that's going downhill at a pretty good speed by that time. And that's when the foreigners really began to get a little bit excited about these dollars that they had in the foreign banks and all over the world. And of course, you'd see the same way. You'd be the same way if you had the money. You'd want to get it into something a little more secure. And then some of our people in Washington, the Congress, pointed out all these things that were going to happen. They fell on deaf ears. No one paid a bit of attention to it. And so as they took this cover off of our money in '67, we then wound up in coming into a deal where we might liken it to going into a poker game with the old pros that play the 16 brands of poker with a stranger every Friday night at the fish fry down on the riverbank. And they get all the stranger's money, and long about the time they got everything and a bunch of his IOUs and his car and his farm and a few other things written down, why somebody blows a whistle and rings a bell and says, well, boys, we always quit this game at this time, so we're all going home, and thank you, Joe, we'll see you tomorrow, and collect everything. So we were caught in that position with the money experts of the world at this world poker game of gold, and they had all the cards. So what did we do? Instead of sending experienced experts, people that had been schooled in this gold business, to go to this gold poker table with the world money changers and gold experts of the world in Europe, they didn't come to us, we had to go to their ball game. We found ourselves in a position where they had us in a sack, and all these foreign nations had a hold of the top of this sack. Now, we've been in this sack for a long time. Many people have stopped and asked me and said, well, Mr. Hammett, why is it that a big, strong nation like the United States bows and stoops and scrapes and does all these subservient things to all these little bit of two-bit nations here, there, and every place else around the world? Why do we do this thing? Well, we were going through a position like the man who had written a hot check or had at the bank for $10,000 and then signed a note for it, and he couldn't pay off, and he was being badgered by the banker, and he either had to pay off or they were going to come and get his house and car and his wife and everything that went with it. So we were in that same position. All we were been doing in all these manipulations and acts we've been going through have been nothing but buying time, in my opinion, to try to forestall this thing which was coming. So little by little we appeased them with the last 25% of the gold deal, and it wasn't until President Nixon put an embargo on the outflow of this gold that it was stopped. That's the first time. There was no more gold paid to these people. Well, when that happened, they were a little bit ired and riled about it, and that's another time when we began to get a lot of static back from the foreign holders of the gold certificate, or the money certificates, dollars. So in that respect, the next thing that happened with the gold deal was that we sent people over to this poker game, this table I told you about, to negotiate. Well, we'd in the meantime cooked up an idea that we could have paper gold Well, there's no such a thing as paper gold, and of course the experts knew that, and they laughed at such an idea, and yet it was merely, you might say, another type of a promissory note by the United States government, where we would switch a note from one type of a liability that we had into another one and make it look a little different. But these people weren't satisfied with that abroad, and so we sent a man who was in the habit of making chili and barbecue down in Texas, John Connolly, over to Europe. And I don't think John Connolly has ever seen a $20 gold bill in his life or handled any gold money. And he goes over to negotiate this gold problem. And so he's in the sack, and they've got a hold of the top of it. So it's a very simple thing. They had their price. They told him what we had to have. And what did they have to have? Well, they demanded, which was all a part of the plan, a devaluation of our dollar. Now, this was just exactly what Roosevelt had done in 1934, only it was in reverse. The whole thing coming back just in reverse procedure. So these experts, who knew nothing about the program, I claim, in the past, they decided to devalue the dollar. That was the way to save the country. And the day they devalued the dollar, they just took us completely out of circulation where gold was concerned. And gold, instead of remaining at a pegged price of $35 an ounce, began to jump up, which it normally should because of taxes and cost and one thing and another and inflation in it. And this gold began to jump up, as we had predicted, many of us years before, to where it began to hit 75 and 80 and 90 and $100 an ounce. And just the other day was at $125 an ounce, this $35 an ounce gold. Now, what does that mean? That means that these foreigners, who through these years had accumulated all of our gold and also IOUs from us to the tune of about $40 billion we're talking about now, they weren't satisfied. They still wanted more because we weren't able to pay off. So we had to concede, do this, do that, and everything. So we were sold the idea to devalue our dollar, 10%. And the minute we did that, the price of the gold went up. And when the price of gold went up, this little country that had $100 billion worth of our gold on hand immediately had $400 billion worth of our gold. That's simple arithmetic. Any 5-year-old kid could figure that out. And where you've got $500 billion worth of gold against, or $400 billion worth of gold against $100 billion that you had before, that certainly makes that country's mark or franc or yen, whatever it is, look pretty good. And that's what the people started wanting to invest their money in, something that had some gold behind it. And then on the other hand, by looking at our side of the picture, what did it do to us? If we owed $40 billion worth of IOUs that we couldn't pay on a balance of payment that we already owed to these cats, we owed $160 billion worth of it overnight. So where we had the big stockpile and devalued the dollar and increased the value of our own gold, we had this trick worked on us just in reverse, and today we're in this very position. Now, this little story, bringing people up, refreshing your minds as to what happened and how we got to this position, I think is a very interesting sequence of events that took place, and you know why we're in this position. I mean, it's no secret. It's just an ordinary, simple manipulation of money and gold and politics that have entered into it. So, as a result of all of these things that took place, in the early formation of the Export-Import Bank and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the International Finance Corporation and many of these other things, back at the time that a great statesman and a loyal American, George Malone, my secretary jotted down a few memorandums here of some of the things that he had said and put into the record. And he says, let's put this into the record. Boiled down, this is international socialism at its worst. Now, these are the things that were being projected on us back in 1958, and we were warned against, and no warnings were ever heeded. An averaging and leveling of the standards of living. Now, we were supposed to divide up everything we had with everybody that didn't have anything all over the world. And he says, an averaging and leveling of the standards of living of the world through a division of our wealth. A living standard being the highest in the world here, there is no place for us to go under this share and share-alike system except down. And that's just what we've been doing. The desire on the part of the rest of the world is natural. The desire on our part is stupid. It's incredibility. Our nation cannot long survive this free trade and dishonest currency method of the division of its wealth with the nations of the world. The objectives of many well-meaning people going along with these policies is impractical and idealistic. Free immigration and the one world citizenship with world peace at the end of the rainbow. Another one. Unfortunately, a continuation of these policies can well result in a wrecking of the economic system of the United States, and the only nation that can spearhead the defense of the Western Hemisphere is the United States. So if we're wrecked, where are we? He says, setting an example, the United States government cannot consistently recommend sound policies to foreign governments as a condition for loans when it is not following such policies itself. It can preach effectively only by example. It can do more for world revival by making its own economy sound and strong and free than by trying to put temporary props under economies built on the treacherous foundations of totalitarian controls. And I don't think truer words were ever spoken. We must reduce our unparalleled federal expenses. We must reduce taxes to a level under which wealthy private enterprise can permanently function, and we must cease trying to maintain low interest rates for inflationary means, and above all, we must turn to a real instead of a mere technical gold standard. Now, in foreign aid, he says, it is clear that the United States cannot feed the whole world. The United States has millions of mouths to feed, but foreign nations have many additional millions of mouths more than America. It should be obvious that the real solution is not to distribute scarcity, but to restore production at home. In countries where looting by police and by socialistic and communistic countries, by agrarian reforms, which seize lands, break up farms, and displace populations, by export and import barriers, by exchange controls, and by price fixing, which makes it unprofitable or grow impossible, or to grow food and transport and sell food, and because of America's smaller supplies of food in relation to the world demand, the effort to atone, even moderately, for the food shortages in foreign countries must cause soaring prices and shortages at home. This was in 1947, incidentally. So you can see that all of these warnings by our good, solid citizens that we had, who were trying to tell the people something, they had a message, it didn't take. He goes on, the principle that help from outside to any country goes eventually to relief, the least urgent needs which the government of that country then decides to meet. For example, if we did not send food to a foreign government, we will be accused of starving its people. Yet we forget that foreign government conscripts enormous standing armies from men who otherwise would work on farms to produce their food, to the extent that that foreign government's food problem is then solved by outside gifts. When this elementary principle is kept in mind, it is recognized how unimportant and even futile it is to require that our loans to foreign governments be used only for specific purposes. We could, for example, insist that our funds be used only to buy foodstuffs, but to the extent that we realize the borrowing country and the need of supplying its own foodstuffs, we merely release resources that in that country to supply some less urgent need. And I think that everyone in this room well realizes that our gifts of food and so forth have been going down the drain. I know some captains of some large grain-carrying ships. And back here several years ago under the Johnson administration, India was in a terrible situation. They had to have food. We had to feed India and everybody else. Well, they got along pretty well until all this came about. So anyway, under their system, we sent down shipload after shipload after shipload of grain. Our ships would come up and berth right alongside of a Russian freighter in India. And this grain sent to India would be transferred right over into a Russian vessel. And Russia would pay India in gold, which they had got from the United States with our paper money that we gave them the plates. And India would in turn use the gold to build up their supply against the ruby and the rest of the stuff. Now this thing went on and on and on. This is common knowledge. It's no secret. These things have been practiced worldwide in this giveaway deal, starting with the Marshall Plan. That's really what put us behind the 8 ball with our money and our continued expense of troops abroad all over the world. Well, people feel somewhat assured by statements that our loans, our gifts, have been earmarked for only special purposes unless we undertake to control all the expenditures of the borrowing country, and that's impossible. Well, he goes on with a few other things, and he says that it's like the last bucket full of water after it has been poured into an already partly filled tub. You can't tell it's in there. Now, on foreign loans, he said, these were just a few of the summations of a part of the testimony. It says, the bulk of our past and prospective government loans to foreign governments are little better than thinly disguised gifts, and I don't think there's anybody that'll question that. It is hardly realistic to adopt any other assumption in view of the history of intra-governmental loans. The possible chief source of pressure in the United States loans and gifts to foreign nations arise out of confused philosophy which assumes that it is our duty of the richer nations to share their wealth with the poorer nations. The constant application of such a philosophy would make it incumbent upon Europe to share its wealth with India and China and Africa. Consistency would, in fact, first of all, require the equalization of incomes both within the United States and with other foreign nations, and under such a program of gifts, loans from the United States to these countries, lower income persons and groups in the United States, in effect, are subsidizing people and groups in Europe and the other foreign countries with higher incomes and higher standings of living than they have themselves in this country. And that's exactly what's happened. There is no scientific or objective way of measuring either Europe, Asia, or Africa and other foreign nations' need for aid, nor is there any other manner in which our available resources can be measured for supplying it. You can't buy goodwill, and it's a profound mistake to count on gratitude or to believe that we can purchase any permanent goodwill by government loans or gifts to foreign countries. And in this connection, I think it is obvious that if we fail to buy gratitude and goodwill by writing off $30 billion worth of Lend-Lease to Great Britain and $110 billion worth of Lend-Lease and gifts to Russia and practically all of the others, the foreign press comments and propaganda on our help to these nations has been everything except expressions of gratitude from the governments who have received our taxpayers' favors. This man was telling us just exactly what is happening today and what has happened all of these years, and that's where your money's gone. Now, I want to say a word or two. Am I over time here by any manner or means here? I don't want to impose upon the next speaker here. The Export-Import Bank, for an example. The Export-Import Bank, as you know, was established in 1934 and started with $11 million. In 1957, at the time that all of this big push was going on, capital was increased to $1 billion. It can now borrow up from the United States government at any one time up to $5 billion, imagine. Now, not a single dollar, there's not an agency in the United States government that can loan a United States citizen or a manufacturing company or an industry, even our important railroad systems even, any money for any purpose. There has been some loans, but I mean legitimately through a lending source and institution, we don't have it. But we have these for every foreigner there is in the world. The Export-Import Bank was originally set up in the belief that it would promote foreign trade by making loans to foreign buyers. However, the import bank soon drifted away from commercial loans and went into the political loan business, which was in the beginning thinly disguised as relief. President Truman on March 12, 1947 made his first appeal to Congress for a loan of $400 million to Greece and Turkey. And he made this appeal in the argument that the very existence of the Greek state was being threatened by terrorist activities, by thousands of armed men led by communists and so forth. This certainly is one of the early examples of the political loan started by the Export-Import Bank. It is the opinion of many sound economists that all of this must lead up to the conclusion that the business of international lending should be returned to private institutions. Now, the Export-Import Bank has been loaning money in Asia to 26 countries, Canada, Africa, 26 countries, there aren't any other countries there, Europe, 24 countries, Latin America, 32 countries, including Cuba, South Pacific, 4 countries, and the Caribbean, 6 countries. That's 119 countries that we have been in business sending money and gold to since 1934. Now, in this situation, we came into this deal with 1 vote against 66 when it was organized, and today there's 100 and some that are involved in it. I attended a meeting of some bankers and attorneys in a very swanky club, and we had a speaker there who had been groomed and was an understudy, a Harry Dexter White, that set this whole thing up. And when he began to talk about all these billions of dollars being projected for these foreign countries. Well, to make a long story short, I took him to task on the matter and embarrassed him a little bit. And I wrote a letter as a result to the government in Washington and insisted that a fellow like this, when I found out he was an understudy of Alger Hiss and Harry Dexter White, that after all these years he should be taken out of this job if we're going to furnish our tax money to these foreigners, that was a demand I was making. I got a letter back from the State Department that they agreed and they were sorry, but that the whole system was set up under foreign direction and foreign operation, and that the United States government had no word in the matter at all, and that everybody hired was hired by foreign countries who managed and ran and had the whole ball of wax. In other words, they decide who's going to get our money, and they come back to us and get it from our treasury, and then they pass it out. So I got real concerned the other day before I came up here, and I sent up to Washington to get a statement of the Export-Import Bank's condition, and I found out that I got a catalog that was about the size of a Sears Roebuck catalog with loans that you would never believe or imagine. Am I about out of time here? Well, in conclusion, let me just say a few things. There are some things that we talk about that are wrong, and I want to give you a little word on what I think could be done by you and contacting your congressmen and your senators and others. It's obviously very clear that the United States cannot feed the whole world. We should stop that. Help from the United States to any foreign country goes eventually to relief and so forth. I've covered that. But when we get down here to the gold situation, we should insist that the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and all the other foreign lending agencies should either be put under government control where we have something to say about them, or we should get out of them. The United States should return to a gold standard instead of a merely technical gold basis for our currency. We should invite all nations to cooperate in returning to this gold standard, hold individual conferences and so forth, and maintain parities preferable related to each other. We should immediately repeal the acts now existing that prevent American citizens from freedom in trading, owning, producing, or in any other manner, shape, or fashion handling gold. Now, that has been proposed, and I believe with some pressure from people, we might be able to restore our rights and get back in that. And then, at long last, I think that the greatest shock in the world would come if our government would announce that they're going to subsidize the rehabilitation cost of these gold mines, and that we are going back in the gold business, that we're going to reopen 9,000 gold mines in the United States, and I believe that would shock our foreign people into some degree of respect for us and for our dollar. And I believe that with the help of good people who are interested in these things, that this can be done, and I'd like very much to have the help of everybody to get us back to where we can go back into the gold business, where we can own gold freely like the Constitution said we could, and where we can at least get ourselves back and produce gold, put it in our treasury, and have something back there that would back up our dollar a little bit. Thank you indeed for allowing me to come here.
Sorry to put any pressure on you. But we're under pressure.